Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome to the Emory University School of Law's third lecture in the Conversations About Racism in the 21st Century series. I am Professor and Vice Dean Joanna Shepard, one of the organizers of this event, along with my colleague, Professor Dorothy Brown. Well, I am so excited that given the election chaos going on around us right now, we are able to welcome today's speaker. As you all know, the purpose of this series is to educate those of us at Emory Law, Emory University, and the broader community about the role of the law in perpetuating racial injustice. Today, we are in the middle of a situation in which the law and the courts are being used in an explicit attempt to undermine our democratic process. Although the threats to our democracy affect all of us, certainly, we do know that the voter suppression efforts have been especially targeted at certain racial groups. So I'm thrilled that we have close to 100 faculty, students, staff, and alumni joining us today for the lecture of Professor Carol Anderson. Professor Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She is a nationally recognized historian, educator, and author. Her research focuses on public policy, particularly the ways that domestic and international policies intersect with the issues of race, justice, and equality in the U.S. Her most recent book, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy from 2018, has been longlisted for the National Book Award and a finalist for the PEN Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. She is also the author of the well-known book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, which was a New York Times bestseller, Washington Post Notable Book of 2016, and a National Book Critics Award Circle winner. Today, Professor Anderson will lecture on elections, voting, and race, a very timely topic. And although I know she's going to give us an amazing overview of the history of voter suppression efforts, I hope she'll take a little bit to talk about what's going on today. Professor Anderson is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I will facilitate a short question and answer period to follow. So we received some questions in advance of the lecture, but for those of you who would like to ask questions that might be prompted by things Professor Anderson says, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions throughout today's lecture. Okay, Professor Anderson, the floor is yours. I think you're on mute.
There we go. Took a minute. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I think that this lecture today, you know, we really do have, I think the not just the United States, but the world probably has Georgia on our minds right now. And so if we could have a little mood music about some Ray Charles, that would kind of sum up where we are. But I want, as a historian, I want to take us back and then bring us forward. And Georgia, oh, Georgia, is a great place to start. Because what we're talking about here is denying American citizens the right to vote. And we often think about that in terms of the violence. And so that's why Georgia is just on my mind right now. Because in 1946, a man named Maceo Snipes, he was a veteran, a World War II veteran. He had fought fascists. He came back home to Georgia. He came back home wanting some of that democracy that he had fought so hard for. And there was an election happening in Georgia right then. 1946 was a gubernatorial election. And Eugene Talmadge was running for governor. And Gene Talmadge was a white supremacist of the first magnitude. And he was running on a platform of you keep them right where they belong. Because see, the Supreme Court had ruled on Smith v. Allwright that the white primary was no longer constitutional. And Gene Talmadge was determined to reinstate the white primary here in Georgia. Well, Maceo Snipes wasn't going to have any of that. And so he went to go vote. And there was a sign over the door, something to the effect, the first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. Maceo looked at that sign and went, I fought fascist. What you got? And he went right on in and he cast his vote. He walked out, nothing. It's like, all right. He went home, nothing. All right. But a few days later, there was a knock at the door. Maceo answered. There was a white man standing there on his porch. He said, "Could you come out?" And Maceo was like, "Sure." Because remember, he fought fascists in World War II. He steps out on his porch, then he sees three other white men. And then he hears, ch-ch, and it was a firing squad. And they laid Maceo out. Maceo was the only Black person who voted in Taylor County, Georgia in 1946, because the message was clear. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. That's how we often think about disfranchisement, this kind of physical violence. But I want us to focus in on the bureaucratic violence that wipes out millions of Americans, that creates another kind of death, what I call a civic death. And so I'm going to start, not with Georgia this time, but with Mississippi. I know that's shocking. But in Mississippi, 1890, there were about 190,000 African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi. And they had been mobilizing and organizing with poor whites about getting elected officials in place who understood the needs of poor folk, of working folk. And the Mississippi legislature looked up and went, "Oh, we got to stop this. Oh, we have got to stop this." And so they were thinking about what we have to do. We have to create the aura of legitimacy on how we're going to stop this. And then we're going to write laws. And we're going to write the laws in such a way that makes it clear we don't want Black folk to vote, without making it clear that we don't want Black folk to vote. We've got to stop Black voters. Now, the problem with that was the 15th Amendment of the Constitution that said, "The state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." So Mississippi is sitting there saying, how do we write a law that says we don't want Black folk to vote, without writing a law saying we don't want Black folk to vote? And then it was like, got it. We are going to use the legacies of slavery and make those legacies like wealth, literacy, citizenship, the access to the ballot box. And they started writing the laws. And they said, as they're creating the aura around them, they said, and this is about to stop all of that massive, rampant voter fraud that's happening in our elections. This is to protect the integrity of democracy. This is to end corruption at the ballot box. These are progressive measures to ensure the sanctity of democracy. It sounded good. But behind the scenes, Jim Big Chief Vardaman, who would become governor of Mississippi, said, the only reason we changed our Constitution was to eliminate the N word from politics. And so here's how they did it. And I'm not going to give the whole thing, but you get a sense of it. The poll tax. The poll tax. The aura says, democracy is expensive. Having all of these elections, and you got to have people counting the votes, people taking the votes, places where people are voting. It's just expensive. And if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee to ensure that democracy runs smoothly. So you see two things happening there. One is that it flips the onus of smooth functioning elections on the citizen solely, and not on the state. And the second thing that it does is says, just pay. Well, after hundreds of years of slavery, then followed by the Black Codes after the Civil War, followed by sharecropping. Just pay is racialized. What just pay meant. In Mississippi, it accounted to 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income. 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income to be able to vote. And the way that the law was written, it required a cash payment. Well, with sharecropping, you get paid somewhere in October, November. The poll tax was due somewhere in the spring when you didn't have cash. And the poll tax was cumulative. So that if you couldn't pay that first year after you turned 21, and it took you up till the time when you were 41, 20 years, you owed 20 years of back poll taxes before you could vote. Then there was the literacy test. The literacy test, again, is about perfecting and cleaning up democracy by making sure you have an electorate that knows our laws, our value systems, our rules. And so it's not too much to ask that you read a section of the Constitution. Well, after hundreds of years of slavery, where literacy could get you killed, followed by unfunded and underfunded and non-funded public school systems for Black children, literacy. All the way up until the 1940s, over 50% of Black adults in Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina had less than 5 years of formal Jim Crow education. Yet, we are asking them to be able to read sections of the Constitution as if they had an Emory J.D. Worse is that in 1898, the US Supreme Court in the Williams decision ruled that the poll tax and the literacy test did not violate the 15th Amendment because everybody had to pay the poll tax and everybody had to read. Everybody hadn't gone through centuries of slavery. But the poll tax and the literacy test, as well as other components of the Mississippi Plan, were so effective and so devastating. And with that Supreme Court ruling, they metastasized throughout the South. So by the time we get to 1940, only 3% of Black adults are registered to vote in the South. 3%. That is part of the catalyst for the civil rights movement that takes us all the way to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. It was that cataclysm on the bridge where you have nonviolent protesters led by John Lewis at the front and Hosea Williams at the front, confronting Alabama State Police, as well as Sheriff Jim Clark and his deputies on horseback with bullwhips. We see the images, we know the images, we hear the screams. When that footage came through that evening on the evening programs, in fact, ABC cut into its movie of the week, Judgment at Nuremberg, to show the footage of Bloody Sunday, America was repulsed and angry. And this becomes part of a key factor in Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What made the Voting Rights Act of 1965 such an amazing piece of legislation was its preemptive components, pre-clearance. It said that states that had a demonstrated history of discriminating against its citizens' right to vote, and there were formulas for that, that those states had to come under, had to have their voting rights laws, any proposed changes were okayed by the US Department of Justice first, or by the federal courts in DC, before that law could be implemented. What that did was, prior to, states would implement these really horrific, racially discriminatory laws. Then there would be litigation after litigation after litigation, which meant then that there were elections after elections after elections based on a racially discriminated against electorate. The Voting Rights Act stopped that, or slowed it down tremendously. The Voting Rights Act was so powerful that in early 1960, only 5% of age-eligible African-American adults were registered to vote in Mississippi. 5% in Mississippi. By 1967, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, almost 60% of age-eligible African-American adults were registered to vote. That was the power of the Voting Rights Act. And it had crosshairs on it almost immediately. South Carolina came after it. Virginia came after it. Mississippi came after it. A series of reauthorizations that initially were really knocked down, drag out battles happened. And then came Shelby County v. Holder in 2013 that gutted the pre-clearance provision, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. In that 5-4 decision, John Roberts argued that, racism is really no longer the factor that it once was in the United States. Particularly the kinds of racism that made the Voting Rights Act necessary. I mean, now we have Black elected officials, we have Hispanic elected officials. And, the Voting Rights Act picks on the South. So many of the jurisdictions that were under the Voting Rights Act in 1965, they're still there. Now, I have to say that there is so much wrong with that decision, starting with racism is no longer a factor, or not the factor that it once was in American society. In 2006, in the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice laid before Congress over 700 proposed changes to voting laws that the DOJ had blocked because they were racially discriminatory. And that is not since 1965, that's since 1982, over 700 changes. And this picking on the South. There are bail-in and bail-out provisions in the Voting Rights Act. And what those bail-out provisions basically say is, don't discriminate for a series of a few years, somewhere between 5 to 10 years. Just don't discriminate, and you are bailed out. The fact that were so few that were bailed out is not a factor of the Voting Rights Act. It is a factor of the continuing drive to discriminate against American citizens' right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, we saw a wave of voter suppression laws come into force. And they had been drafting this for a while. And the catalyst for this voter suppression was the election of Barack Obama. So one of the things that we hear in the United States with the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and his reelection in 2012 was that, America has crossed the racial Rubicon. We have overcome. I mean, we put a Black man in the White House twice. That's not quite accurate, because what that is saying is that the majority of whites voted for Barack Obama and elected him. No, the majority of whites did not vote for Barack Obama, neither in 2008 nor in 2012. In fact, the majority of whites who voted have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964, since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Not since 1964 have the majority of whites in America who vote cast their ballots for a Democratic candidate for president. And it didn't happen with Obama. So how did he get into the White House, you might ask? He got there because he had a sizable number of whites, but he had an incredible ground game of organizing and mobilizing that brought millions of new voters to the polls. They were overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression, particularly after Shelby County v. Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act. And here's how it works. Again, it's going to sound legitimate, just like the Mississippi Plan of 1890. The language about massive, rampant voter fraud and the need to protect the integrity of our democracy, the need to protect and secure the integrity of our elections. They're at stake. These people are trying to steal the election. Well, that's not true. Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, did a study from 2000 to 2014. He found that over 1 billion out of 1 billion votes cast in the United States in elections during that time period, there were 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. 31 out of 1 billion. And believe it or not, there are some folks who won't believe a study done by a California law professor. But when you listen to the voter suppressors themselves, and they have to tell the truth, like in a court of law, this is what comes out. So like when Greg Abbott, who was the Secretary of State in Texas, he's now the governor, when he was the Secretary of State, and he was arguing that the need for Texas's voter ID law was to stop the massive rampant voter fraud that was happening there. And so Judge Ramos said, how many? Judge Ramos said, how many? Massive, how many? Rampant, how many? Two. 2 cases of voter impersonation fraud in the past 10 years out of 20 million votes. 2 out of 20 million. That's not massive. That's not rampant. Or Chris Kobach out of Kansas arguing the same thing. We have all of these non-citizens on our voter rolls trying to steal our elections. And the judge says, okay, so how many? Massive, how many? 1. There was 1 case in Kansas, and it was a man who was going through the naturalization process and didn't know he couldn't cast a ballot until his citizenship was granted. But that is the foundational lie for voter suppression in America in the 21st century. And just like Mississippi, we have an array of policies We have voter ID laws. We have poll closures. We have purges. We have shutting down early voting, and we have extreme partisan gerrymandering. I'm going to focus in on just a couple of those so you can get a sense of how it works, how it looks legitimate, when in fact it is anything but. Let's go with voter ID laws first. 2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, Texas implemented its voter ID law. The way that the voter ID law worked was that you had to have a government issued photo ID to vote. But your ID from a state college or university did not count. But your concealed gun card registration did. Guns, yes. College, no. So you can see how you can begin to carve out your electorate by identifying the types of IDs that those who are more likely to vote for you or those who are least likely to vote for you have. And then make those IDs, to weigh those IDs to make one group eligible and the other ineligible. What Texas also knew was that 1/3 of its counties did not have a driver's license bureau. That was going to come to about 1.6 million Texans, overwhelmingly Hispanic, Black, and poor, who did not have access. Now, Texas, in one of its original iterations of the bill, understood that phenomenon, and it was going to take about a 250-mile round trip for people to be able to get to the nearest driver's license bureau to be able to vote, to get the driver's license card they needed to be able to vote. And they were going to reimburse them. Before the bill was passed, there was a red line put through that. And so I ask you, if you don't have a driver's license and you don't drive, how do you go 250 miles to get the driver's license you need in order to vote? You create an obstacle, and then you have an obstacle to the obstacle. Alabama is another great one for this. Alabama, in fact, it's the legislators who crafted Alabama's voter ID law. They had been recorded saying, how do we depress the Black voter turnout? Because all of these Aborigines and all of these illiterates will get on these HUD finance buses and go to the polls. In that law, you had to have a government issued photo ID to be able to vote. But your public housing ID did not count. 71% of those in public housing at Alabama are African American. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund identified that for many of them, it was the only government issued photo ID that they had. And Alabama still said, no, public housing ID is not an acceptable form of government issued photo ID. But does it get more government issued than public housing? Or then what happens in Alabama is that Governor Bentley, listening to his mistress, shuts down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties, making people have to go over to the next county, hopefully to be able to get an acceptable form of government issued photo ID to vote. Why this works so well is that you get the creation of the fear in the American population that democracy is under attack. People are trying to steal this election. And then you get what seems like a reasonable response. All we're asking you to do is to show your ID, because that really plays to a middle class norm. Everybody's got an ID. But the way that these laws are crafted, not every ID counts. by design. And that is why you had the Fourth Circuit looking at North Carolina saying, you have targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Let's talk about early voting, because that's something that doesn't get a lot of attention. And then I'm going to stop and open this up. Early voting, what early voting does is it creates additional opportunities for registered voters, American citizens, to cast their ballot besides on election day on that Tuesday in November. Early voting really opens up the time, particularly for working class folk who cannot get off on election day to go vote. And so they don't have to choose. They, between going to work and getting a paycheck to keep a roof over their heads or food on the table, and exercising their right to vote. In Indiana, in 2008, Indiana went for Obama. And that was a shocking response. Wow. Well, even more shocked were the Republicans in Indiana, because they were like, how did this happen? How did this happen? Well, it happened because African Americans were using early voting as a way to exercise their right to vote. So the response from the Indiana legislature was to craft a law that said counties that have more than 325,000 residents can only have one early voting site. Counties that have fewer can have more. Let me do that again. Counties that have more than 325,000, one. Counties that have fewer residents can have more. There are only 3 counties in Indiana that have more than 325,000 residents. They're the counties: Lake County, where Gary, Indiana is; Allen County, where Fort Wayne, Indiana is; and Marion County, where Indianapolis is. In short, in the 3 counties that account for almost 70% of the state's Black population, each only gets one early voting site. And then there was a caveat put in there, an amendment put in there later on that said if they wanted to have more, then it had to be approved by a unanimously approved by a bipartisan board. And so it's never been approved. The result was that in 2016, in Marion County, Indianapolis, early voting went down by more than 25%. Whereas in Hamilton County, because they got more early voting sites, it went up by 62%. This is the kind of bureaucratic violence that has done damage to American society, that has silenced millions of American citizens, that has made it more difficult to vote in this democracy, that has created hours-long lines in minority communities. This is what this fight for democracy is all about, to make sure that American citizens have the right to vote respected. And we're seeing that battle played out right now in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. That's fascinating, a fascinating history. So if you guys will post questions in the Q&A, as I said, and I will ask those of Professor Anderson. And I'm going to start with a couple of questions we got in advance. So this is, I guess, talking a little bit about the history, the more recent history, and about the implications for today. do you think there is something, I guess the broad frame of this question is what's special about Georgia? And we do know that, in 2016, we had the Kemps, throwing out of 50,000 votes, and we had a lot of purging of the rolls and that sort of thing. Is it possible that some of those efforts, which were so, I don't know, just like kind of shockingly in your face in terms of the efforts, gave a lot of really motivated Georgia to do something differently that now puts us in a different position than a lot of us, we hoped we would be in, but maybe didn't expect we would be in today?
I think that, yes, I think that, Georgia has been at this for a long, long time. In the mid 2000s, shortly after Indiana got its voter ID law approved, and even though Georgia was under the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance provision, Georgia implemented a voter ID law. It did go through the DOJ. The staff attorneys looked at it and said, Lord, this thing is racist. Woo! And just started identifying how racist Georgia's voter ID law was, from the lack of the disparity in private motor vehicles between African Americans and whites, the lack of departments of motor vehicles or DDSs here in the Atlanta area, and it was very systematic in the way that the DOJ staff attorneys went through, and they denied Georgia. The political appointee came in and overrode the staff attorneys. And that is how Georgia's racist voter ID law got implemented, like in 2006, 2007. Georgia's been at this a long time. Then you got the exact match program coming under Brian Kemp as a policy. That thing went to court, said, ooh, the judge said, Lord, this thing is racist. And so then Kemp takes that policy that a judge has said is racist and takes it into a gerrymandered legislature that says, oh, let's have this exact match program. Well, this thing all started totally being revealed beyond those who are really in the weeds looking at election laws. We saw it in 2016, and we really saw it in 2018. But the mobilization from grassroots organizations had begun before then. And so while how blatant it is, know that the mobilization had begun well before most Georgians saw it. The mobilization to litigate like crazy, the motivation to organize and to register folks to vote, to get them their IDs, to holler about poll closures, like we saw in Randolph County, where they said shutting down 7 of 9. All of that work happened beforehand. We're just really seeing it now.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of fire off. What do you think the media gets wrong or ignores when they talk about voter suppression?
Whew, so much.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have 5 hours, but let me try this. So one of the reasons why I wrote the book, One Person, No Vote, was after the 2016 election, I'm hearing the pundits talk about, well, Black folks just didn't show up, because, they were just, one, Obama wasn't on the ticket. And so Black folks really aren't going to vote for somebody who's not Black, which is just so ahistorical, because how many times have there been Black folks on the ticket? Not that often. And Black folks had been voting. So that made no sense. But the other piece were like, and they weren't feeling Hillary. Black people just weren't feeling, because she's Hillary. So they just stayed home. Well, this was the first presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. Mm-hmm. That might have something to do with the 7% drop in Black voter turnout. So that piece, they just got so fundamentally wrong. The other piece is that we consistently heard, and I think this is the first year that it hasn't been consistent, because there's been a lot of work done in seeing these long lines at the polls going, wow, look at that voter enthusiasm. Look how enthusiastic voters are to be out there and voting. And no, what we're looking at is the starving of resources in minority communities to ensure that there aren't enough poll workers and working machines that back up the line, because what we know from the research is that these long lines begin to dissuade people who have to wait in those lines for hours thinking about, I really have to go to work. I really have to pick up my kid. I really have to not vote. So they get a lot of that just wrong, and not calling out voter fraud as a lie. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So another question: what do you think? And I'm sure you could also talk for 5 hours about this, but we'll say, what do you think are the major voting rights violations and voter suppression tactics that we're seeing in this election? So I guess the biggest, the most egregious.
I think the most egregious is the use of COVID-19 as another barrier to access to the ballot box. So when you have states putting in different requirements, like Texas saying if you're under 65, COVID-19 is not a valid excuse. A fear of contracting COVID-19 is not a valid excuse for requesting an absentee ballot. Or places like South Carolina and Alabama requiring witnesses and notaries, which, mitigates the whole reason for an absentee ballot, which is social distancing. So those sorts of things I think have been just absolutely egregious, as well as kneecapping the post office in the midst of a pandemic when folks are needing to use a mail-in ballot to safely vote.
Yeah. Yes, it's especially shocking. Okay. Do you think, this is an interesting question. I'm going to ask this a little bit different than our attendee did. So I think this is kind of a chicken and egg kind of question. So do you think the voter suppression tactics we're seeing in Georgia are because there was a realization that Georgia could flip, or kind of vice versa? Or have the voter suppression efforts riled people up so much that that's why we're seeing so many people come to the voting, coming to vote, and that's kind of generated, this possible flip of Georgia?
I think that after the 2000 census, when it became clear that Georgia was having a changing demographic, and that demographic, so part of what we're looking at here is just politics. When the Republican Party wooed in the Southern Democrats, and the Southern Democrats' foundation is anti-civil rights, anti-Blackness. When the Republican Party wooed them in, the party moved so far to the right that it just can't resonate with a broader demographic group of American citizens. Their policies just don't resonate in the majority. And so the response was, in seeing these changing demographics, I mean, it's like when Lindsey Graham says, we're not generating enough angry old white men to stay in business for long. And so that changing demographic here in Georgia became part and parcel of the motivation of how do we begin to shut down those Americans that we believe will not vote for us. And that's what we're seeing coming through from the 2000s up into now. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a fun question before I get back to the serious questions. Dr. Anderson, do you have any plans to run for public or political office?
Oh, God, no.
Okay. Just clearly people are impressed with your speaking abilities. Okay, so back to serious. Would you please speak to the bureaucratic violence in Florida with regard to the voter suppression of ex-felons who've served their time but are now required to pay fees to vote?
Oh, yeah. So just quick history. 1867 Reconstruction Act, the radical Republicans pass a law saying that part of that law says Black men have the right to vote. That's not exactly what it says, but that's the implications of the Reconstruction Act of 1867. 1868, Florida passes a felon disfranchisement law and has a series of laws then that are only applicable to African Americans or only enforced against African Americans. So it is a way to strip them of their voting rights by putting the label of felon on them. And so it makes it clear you're not disfranchising them because they're Black. You're just disfranchising them because they're felons. Well, that is what Amendment 4 in 2018 was dealing with, was the law of 1868 that had made 1.7 million Floridians unable to vote. 40% of Black men in Florida could not vote. When Amendment 4 passes by 65%, you saw the Republicans and Ron DeSantis basically heart clutch, Elizabeth, Fred Sanford, Elizabeth, I'm coming. They're trying to figure out how to stop this thing. They come up with basically a poll tax, saying that the completion of your sentence is you have to pay your fines, fees, and restitution. That's a poll tax because we don't ask people to pay your property tax to be able to vote.
Right.
We don't ask them to pay your income tax to be able to vote, but we're asking them to pay. So the depth of your wallet determines your access to the ballot box. Thing goes all the way up. The 11th Circuit ruled, the 11th Circuit ruled that this was not a poll tax and that they did have to pay, and that the state did not have to tell them how much they owe. So you get the worst of the poll tax of the Mississippi plan, you gotta pay to vote, and the literacy test of the Mississippi plan, where the state could ask you an unanswerable question. And your inability to answer an unanswerable question blocked your access to the ballot box. Unanswerable. In Mississippi, one of the questions was, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Unanswerable. In Georgia, one of the unanswerable questions was, how high is up? So, right, so what's happening in Georgia is massive bureaucratic violence. And so when you heard Florida called and you heard all of this moaning and bemoaning, what you didn't hear were that there were hundreds of thousands of people blocked from access to the ballot box because of the poll tax that was put on them and the 11th Circuit's ruling that the state didn't have to tell them how much they owe. That's bureaucratic violence.
Yes, it is. Okay, so I'm going to combine a few questions here. So you've mentioned a lot about, so I think so let's go back to the elections in 2008 and 2012. And you've talked about how a lot of Black, Hispanic, and Asian American voters came out as first-time voters. What was done then that hadn't been done previously to, I guess, motivate these first-time voters? So I'll start with that question.
And I think one of the key things, and this is that they didn't go out going, hey, vote, because that means nothing. But yeah, they started talking with people about what they wanted for their lives. What were their dreams like? What was important to them? And so just sitting down and talking to folks about what's important to them, and then being able to link that up with voting, policymakers, and laws, the connections become clear. And so that's what they did. It takes time to do that. So you can't like swoop in October. You have to start early on. And that was what was so different.
Okay. So sticking with the idea of the voters, the people of color, why do you think, so I'm combining some questions here, why do you think the Republican Party has this time attracted so many Hispanic voters despite the xenophobia and the border rhetoric, the Black and people of color voters despite this very blatant voter suppression? What's happening? Explain something to us that makes sense.
Okay, so what part of what we have to understand is that there has consistently been Hispanics who are Republicans. And that is a legacy of the kind of staunch anti-communism that the Republicans had. And so you see what we talk about, because I don't want to lump Latinos, because that is a multi-group, right? So Cuban Americans have a different perspective, a political, not all Cuban Americans, of course, but a different political vision than, say, Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans. And that is why just saying, well, despite the border, because what they saw was he's against Castro, he's against Cuba. So that's the alpha and the omega there. Um, and so when the Telemundo showed that when you split the vote in Florida between Cuban Americans and Puerto Ricans, it is absolutely inverse. So that you get the wide majority of Cuban Americans going for Trump and the vast majority of Puerto Ricans going for Biden. So that requires then deeper analysis into what we're calling Latinos. Okay. What we're seeing, I believe, with, bless their hearts, is the kind of fake allure of I got mine wealth, that kind of proximity to Trump's fake wealth. If you just work hard, you can get this, without really doing the kind of analysis about the structural inequalities in the US and the ways that those structural inequalities. So if you get a narrative of just, you can make it, you can make it, you can make it, and being around somebody who looks like they've made it. And there's a wonderful piece, I can't remember whether it was Jamel or Brittany, that wrote about how the kind of patriarchy that exudes out of Trump, the misogyny that exudes out of Trump, is attractive to some small percentage of Black men. And so that's what we're seeing. But
So on that point, I recall, and I don't know if this is true for this election, but I know in the past it has been true, that I think Black women voters have a higher turnout kind of consistently throughout history than any other gender, race kind of category. So why is that? I mean, I can think of a lot of different reasons, which maybe they're all true, or do you think there's some factors that are more important than others?
I think it's true. And Martha Jones has written a fabulous book called Vanguard. And she is she was an attorney, and she's now a history professor at Johns Hopkins. And so Vanguard is the book on this. And it's the way that Black women organize in their vision about society. A vision that requires mobilization, a vision that sees the whole for the most part, so that good schools aren't just about Black children being able to have good schools. It's about everybody being able to have good schools. And that you've got to work within these systems, around these systems, over these systems, in order to create that kind of world where the nastiness of divide and conquer cannot work. And so it is that kind of broader vision and mobilizing and organizing that has been absolutely essential in the way that Black women approach politics.
Okay. So a question about the efforts of Stacey Abrams over the last few years. How much do you think that has made a difference in what we're seeing in this election in Georgia? And if it has made a big difference, how can we spread those efforts more widely, I guess, within the state and outside of the state as well?
So I think, as I said, there have been groups on the ground for years, including Stacey's original group, the New Georgia Project, that have been really doing this work. What Fair Fight for Action did was to take that work and then explode it into key battleground states. So I think they're operating in some like 20 states or so. One of those states being Wisconsin. So when we think about what happened there in the primary, that was the work of Wisdoms and Fair Fight for Action, with other groups doing that kind of grassroots mobilizing, organizing, registering folks to vote, and litigating. So Fair Fight has in fact exploded out of Georgia. It is, what we're seeing is, what we know is that we have more people in the 2016 election did not vote than who actually cast a ballot. Yeah. In this democracy. And so getting to those folks, knocking down those barriers of suppression, because the other thing that voter suppression does, and this is what these organizations like Fair Fight understand, Voter suppression is designed to create voter depression so that people believe that the system is so rigged that their vote doesn't matter. So why should they even bother? So that is what this engagement is about, is to break apart not just voter suppression, but the voter depression that is its companion piece in this.
Yeah. Okay. So that seems to have had a big role in Georgia. A related question: would you say that Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams' group, is one of the leading organizations that's trying to raise awareness about voter suppression tactics in Georgia?
Oh, yes. Yes. And again, I would say, the ACLU has been out there. I think, the NAACP has been out there. The LDF has been out there. New Georgia Project, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. All of them have been doing this. I think one of the things that happened is because there was such media attention on that 2018 election here in Georgia, and that Brian Kemp was so blatant with his mess. I mean, the exact match, removing 53,000 voter registrations in October, 70% of which were from African Americans. It was just so good that it raised the profile of Stacey Abrams to the point where it provided that kind of media star power to really begin to interrogate what is happening with voter suppression. So I'll just say, I was in 2 films, documentaries about this, about Georgia and voter suppression in 2018. And it was it brought Hollywood in to look at what was going on here. That's what it's always been happening. But it's been happening. But it was Abrams' star power that allowed the Klieg lights to be able to shine on this and to help generate and create the narrative about what we're really seeing and why.
Yeah. It's inspiring. So what do you think about the Electoral College? Are there any implications of the Electoral College to the voter suppression efforts that you're talking about? Because obviously we could talk all day about the Electoral College, but trying to tie it into what your expertise is.
Yeah, well, so the Electoral College was part of the package put in place in the original Constitution to make the Southern states feel comfortable enough signing on to be part of the United States of America. So there was the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, the Atlantic slave trade for 20 additional years, and the Electoral College. When we understand that it is about protecting slave power, the disproportionate power that the slaveholders had in American politics, now let's ask, what is the use of the Electoral College? It is a legacy that we really need to dismantle. We're seeing where 7 of the last 8 presidential elections have been won by Democrats, but that is not who our presidents have been through those elections, and that is the role of the Electoral College. It is dysfunctional. I mean, right now we're looking and we're saying, we're holding on, trying to figure out who's going to win the Electoral College instead of who has won the popular vote. Yeah.
It's a great history lesson for that. Okay, so just a couple of different questions. Have your books been translated into Spanish or other languages? And if so, have you thought about aiming them at a part of the electorate that may be unaware of some of our voter suppression history in this country could affect their voting choices?
I don't know if they've been translated. I do know that what we did do was to create 2 young adult versions of White Rage and One Person, No Vote, so that we could begin with this evidence-based history lesson for those who are young, so that when they move into the electorate, they have a base of knowledge. But I don't know whether the books have been translated yet.
Okay. how do we combat the limitations of our vote? That sometimes we elect people who then think that they have free reign to do whatever they want rather than serving the needs of their constituents.
And that is where you hold them accountable. That is where calling, when a policy is coming up or you're making, or there's something you really care about, call their offices, email them, attend their town halls. If they're not having town.
Okay, I think that Professor Anderson might be having a small computer glitch for a second. So we'll just give her a minute. I wasn't sure if that was me or her. I'll also put a kind of a plug in for if this is the first of these conversations about racism lectures you've been able to join. The videos of our past two lecturers, which was Professor Fred Smith of the law school talking about qualified immunity, and then Dr. Kimberly Areola from the School of Public Health talking about health disparities and race. Both of those videos are on our website, so the same website that you registered for this. And she's only got about 3 more minutes till we're supposed to end anyway, so I'm guessing she's probably not going to be able to rejoin. So I'm going to go ahead and call it here. Thank you everyone for your participation, and if you would like to watch this video back, it will also be posted on our website in a few days. And similarly, if you would like to send the link or anybody who wasn't able to watch it, you could share it with them that way too. So I believe I probably should go ahead and end it now. So thank you everybody for joining. Bye-bye.